Perhaps you didn't stumble upon these words by accident. Not today, not at this moment. Perhaps for a long time, you've been quietly living as someone trying to hold everything together, holding it together for your family, for others, for the image of what a proper woman should be. But each night, after everyone else is asleep, there's a long, nameless silence, a quiet sigh no one hears, a gaze drifting into the dark, no longer certain of who you are. You've asked yourself, am I really living as myself? Or am I playing a role that's become so familiar I no longer know how to leave it? You've once been gentle, once strong, once self-sacrificing, once endlessly patient, and then you began to no longer recognize the woman in the mirror, not because of age, not because of the wrinkles near your eyes, but because the light in your gaze no longer sparkled like it used to. Carl Jung once said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And perhaps at the very moment you feel exhausted, hollow, when you can no longer bear the repetition, that is when the shadow begins to appear, not as something to fear, but as a part of your soul that you had abandoned, a part that once feared judgment, that once burned with anger, but was never allowed to express it, that once wanted to scream, but had to smile to fit the role, that once wanted to walk away, but chose to stay just to keep the peace. That part is not wrong. It has simply never been heard. And when you begin to hear its soft whisper, I'm so tired. I don't know who I am anymore. I don't want to wear this mask any longer. That is the moment you step across the threshold of truth. Not the truth out there, but the truth within the place you've never dared to touch. Perhaps you've spent a lifetime trying to prove that you're a good daughter, a dutiful wife, a selfless mother, a kind colleague, but there's something you may have forgotten. You've never asked yourself, have I ever been kind to myself? You've healed others, but have you ever embraced the child within you, the one who still cries in silence? Each time she's overlooked, each time she's judged, each time you told yourself, it's okay, I have to be strong. You are not weak. You've just forgotten how to be soft. You are not lost. You've just wandered too far from the center of yourself. And then, one day, you no longer see yourself in those old roles. What once triggered you deeply now passes like a breeze. The people who once made you feel not enough no longer make you shrink. You no longer need to explain, no longer need to justify, no longer need to do something to be loved. You begin to feel still, but not empty, quiet but not alone, light, as if you finally laid something down that you've carried for far too long. You can't name it, but you know, something inside you has changed, not because you've become someone new, but because you've started coming home, not to a house out there, but to the place you once left behind, your truest center, where there are no roles, no rehearsed lines, no burden of pleasing anyone, only you, real, whole, and enough. This is the beginning of a new journey, not one of going somewhere, but of staying with yourself, looking back at everything that was once me and gently letting it go. No more blame, no more bitterness, no more fear of facing what no one ever taught you how to face. Only one quiet question remains. What within me is still waiting to be seen and loved? You don't need the answer today. You only need to stop turning away. Just stay with that feeling, that very strange, very still feeling that somehow makes you realize you are truly alive for the first time in a long while. And if you are here, hearing these words, perhaps you, too, are standing at that edge where the shadow no longer rules you through wounds, where you don't need to resist or run, where you're brave enough to look deep into yourself without falling, because you know, beneath that darkness, there is a light that never left. It's just that you've never stayed still long enough to notice it. You're ready now, not to become someone, but to remember who you've always been. There is no explosion, no obvious sign, no warning. The deepest changes within you begin with things no one else notices. No one except you. It arrives on an ordinary rainy afternoon as you gaze out the window and suddenly feel estranged from your own life. It's not that you hate it. It's just you no longer see yourself in it. The dress you once loved now rests quietly in the closet. The conversation that once excited you now leaves you tired. The person you once longed to be understood by now feels quietly distant in your heart. There's no tragedy, only a widening gap between you and the older version of yourself. Carl Jung once said, "Transformation is not dramatic, it is silent, and it happens from within. Real transformation is nothing like the movies. It's not a grand moment. It's not when you scream, 'I've changed.' It's when you sit still and no longer feel the need to prove anything. You no longer need to win an argument, no longer need to fix someone, no longer need to convince anyone to understand you. You simply breathe softly, and for the first time in many years, you no longer feel trapped inside yourself. Maybe change begins when you decline a social invitation that no longer feels right, or when you quietly walk away from a judgmental conversation without guilt, or when you remain silent in the face of provocation and feel no need to defend yourself. These small acts, like drops of water falling onto the still surface of your consciousness, go unnoticed by others, but ripple through the entire world within you. You are no longer the same as yesterday, not by much, but just enough for you to feel something is melting. Before, you lived from a place of survival. You had to know who you were. You needed answers, a clear definition of your identity. I am strong. I am someone who doesn't cry. I am the one who always knows what's right. But one day, you got tired. Tired of always having to be something. Tired of maintaining a version of yourself that no longer fits who you're becoming. And in that fatigue, something quietly beautiful began. You stopped trying. You let things settle. You let yourself be undefined. You let yourself simply be. And in that state of being the shadow, no longer controls you by whispering, if you're not strong, they'll leave you. If you're vulnerable, they won't respect you. If you don't control it, everything will fall apart. That voice begins to fade, not because you fight it, but because you no longer believe it. You begin to see the boundary between old fear and new truth. You don't need to declare that you've changed. You simply live as if it has already happened, quietly, naturally. And then the world begins to respond differently. The people who once took advantage of you begin to disappear. The meaningless conversations stop seeking you out. The relationships built on your silent endurance begin to tremble. Not because you resist them, but because you are no longer a place where they can anchor. You are no longer the center of every conflict, no longer the healer of everyone but yourself. You begin to choose quietly, without noise. You choose to sit alone rather than force a smile in a crowd. You choose to listen to yourself rather than please everyone. You choose to live honestly rather than protect an outdated image. Change doesn't knock with light and drums. It arrives like morning mist when you realize you're no longer the person you tried so hard to become, and you no longer need to be anyone else, just yourself. And for the first time, that is enough. One day, you'll look back at all the things that once hurt you and feel no need to explain any of it. Not because you've forgotten, not because it no longer matters, but because it no longer defines you. The old memories, they're still there. Like a film you've watched 100 times, you still remember every detail, every glance, every word that left you speechless, every silent night of crying when no one truly heard you. But now, you can look back at it all with a strange kind of distance, the distance of understanding. You used to retell your past through the lens of your wounds. Each time you spoke of it, the old emotions would flood back. You looked for someone to share it with, not because you needed them to understand, but because you had never truly listened to yourself. You shared to feel seen. You shared to feel understood. You shared so you wouldn't feel crazy for having a heart that soft. But now, you don't tell the story anymore. Not because you don't care, but because you've listened enough. You've sat long enough with those memories. You've cried the tears that had never been allowed to fall. You've breathed with the pain until it stopped curling into itself, terrified in the dark. And one day, you realize, I am no longer that story. I am the one sitting here now, peaceful, steady, and full of understanding. Carl Jung once said, I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. You've already chosen, not with words, not with a plan, but with the energy you carry each day. And that energy is no longer, I was abandoned, I was betrayed, I wasn't enough. But instead, I've been through it. I survived. I am moving forward more whole than before. You no longer need anyone to confirm your past was real. You no longer need someone to say, I believe you. You believe yourself. You believe the memory you once buried. You believe the inner voice that had long been drowned out by the noise of others. And because of that, you're no longer angry. You no longer feel the urge to answer the question, why are you like this? You no longer feel the need to explain, no longer need anyone to fully understand your journey. Your silence now is not suppression, it is respect. Respect for what broke you. Respect for the people who couldn't love you the way you needed. Respect for yourself for not giving up. And then you begin to notice something strange. No one drives you crazy anymore. An old message comes through and your heart no longer spins. A harsh comment, and you don't feel the need to respond. A name that once kept you up at night now passes like a breeze, not because you won, but because you're no longer in that battle. You no longer need to find reasons. You no longer crave to understand why they did it, because you've realized they were simply souls wrestling with their own shadows, and you no longer want to stay in those old energetic rooms. True forgiveness doesn't come from nobility. It comes from freedom, from no longer locking yourself in the room of resentment, from opening the door and stepping outside to breathe in something new, peace that needs no validation. You once lived as if you were an unhealed wound, and you did it so well. You were strong. You were resilient. But today, you don't need to live that way anymore. You don't need to recount your pain to feel worthy. You don't need to wear survival like a medal. You no longer build your identity around the story you've been through, because now you've become someone who can look back at the past without living in it, and that's when the past truly loses its power. It no longer controls you, no longer wakes you in the night, no longer demands that you answer, why me? Because now the question has changed to, who am I choosing to become? And you smile. No rush, just enough truth. You are not required to remember. But if one day you turn to look back, you'll see not the wounds, but the road you walked alone in silence, yet still whole in the gentle gaze you now give yourself. You still cry, still feel sad, still have moments of disappointment, hurt, and loneliness. But something has changed, gently, deeply. The waves of emotion no longer drown you. In the past, a single comment could keep you up all night. A passing glare could send you through an entire day feeling like you did something wrong. Even a soft rejection could make you curl inward with the fear of being abandoned, not because you were weak, but because you were never taught how to sit with your emotions without becoming them. You used to be your emotions. If you were angry, you were the anger. If you were sad, you were the sadness. If you felt abandoned, you became someone unworthy of love. You didn't react. You became the reaction. But then, one day, you began to notice the emotion instead of being consumed by it. You no longer needed to scream just to have your anger heard. No longer had to pretend to be okay just to hide your sadness. No longer had to stay silent just to be accepted. You started sitting with yourself, like sitting beside a trembling child. No rejection, no judgment, no rush, just being there, like a spiritual mother, steady, compassionate, not rushing to offer advice, but simply present. Carl Jung once said, "Emotion is the chief source of consciousness. There is no transformation without emotion. Emotions are not something you need to suppress, nor something you must believe without question. Emotions are messengers, not masters. They are waves that carry messages, not storms. You have to live inside forever. You still feel insecure sometimes, but you no longer look for someone to reassure you. You're still afraid of being misunderstood, but you don't try to fix others to be understood anymore. You still have bad days, but you don't label yourself as bad for having one. You let emotions come, flow through, without control, without clinging, and then they leave, not because you've pushed them away, but because you've become spacious enough to hold them without becoming them. That's when you know you've begun to grow emotionally. No one needs to know. No applause is necessary. No one has to say, "You're so calm." You just know. You didn't react the way you used to. You didn't disconnect from yourself. You kept a quiet light within, no matter how strong the winds were outside. And strangely, when you're no longer pulled by emotion, you begin to feel even more, not less. You hear the sound of your own heart. You can sense when someone else is speaking from fear, and when they're speaking from love. You look into someone's eyes and see an unspoken sadness. You even see yourself in them, a version of you that once didn't know how to love herself, and you no longer feel anger toward them, not because they were right, but because you no longer need anyone to be wrong, for you to be okay. That is the power of a woman who has learned to sit with herself, not running from emotion, not forcing herself to be okay, not pretending to be strong, but acknowledging, I have emotions, I feel deeply, and I am still okay. Even on days I feel completely not okay. That's not coldness. That is emotional wisdom. A kind of wisdom that only comes when you've walked through enough storms that the rain no longer scares you. Because now you no longer wear a suit of armor. You wear softness like a new layer of skin. And nothing in this world can take away the stillness you found within. There were things within you that once felt unshakable. You used to believe you were good at enduring, the one who could never stop trying, the one who had to carry it all, because no one else would. You wore those beliefs like armor, not because you liked them, but because you thought you wouldn't survive without them. But then you began to grow tired, not because someone hurt you, not because of a sudden crisis, but simply because it no longer felt true to who you were becoming. The things that once made you proud began to feel heavy. The familiar ways you used to respond started to burden your relationships. And one day, quietly, you stopped wanting to hold it all together, no longer needing to be the strongest one, no longer needing to be understood perfectly, no longer needing to do everything just right. You let yourself unravel bit by bit. No force, no noise. People often think transformation is a dramatic turn, like a shedding of skin, like rising up, breaking everything, and becoming someone entirely new. But the truth is, most real transformation happens like morning mist, dissolving in soft sunlight. No audience, just you, and a strange feeling in your heart. I don't need to hold myself together anymore. Carl Jung once said, we meet ourselves time and again in 1,000 disguises on the path of life. And when your hands grow tired of holding up the mask, you discover what lies underneath. not someone weak, as you once feared, but a face that is very real, very gentle, very human. That self is not perfect. It has fears, it has wounds, it carries spaces that have never been filled. But that self no longer hides. You begin to dissolve away from the definitions you once clung to. I must always be calm. I must never be selfish. I need to be loved to have worth. I must try harder to deserve to stay. Those old affirmations no longer echo in your mind. They begin to melt like thin ice under warm sun. No more fighting, no more running, just a gentle letting go with full awareness. Maybe you don't even realize it, but when you begin to say, I don't know, I'm not ready, I don't need to have the answer right now, that is when you're becoming more real than ever before. No longer needing to solve everything, no longer keeping the peace by swallowing your truth, no longer needing certainty to feel valuable. You're learning how to be present without performing, and that is the beginning of coming home to yourself. The old self doesn't need to be destroyed. It just needs to be seen with gratitude because it once protected you. It helped you survive. It was the shell that kept you from breaking. But now, you're no longer living to survive. You're beginning to live for freedom. And what happens when you let the old self dissolve? You start hearing clearly what your heart actually wants. You find yourself leaving places where your feelings have gone numb. You stop doing things just to avoid being left behind. You say no, not in rebellion, but because you know your yes must be true. You walk away from a relationship not out of hate, but because you no longer need to find yourself in someone else's eyes. You stand alone in a familiar kitchen and suddenly feel more peaceful than ever. No need to please, no need to perform, just being present with yourself. That is the gentle unraveling. It doesn't hurt. It only brings remembering who you were before all the roles, before you learned to harden yourself to be accepted, before you traded inner truth for an outer name. You don't need that anymore. You are safe enough now to take off the mask. And when you do, you see, it's not that you've become weaker. You've grown stronger, quietly, without needing to prove it. You once loved with everything you had, not because you had plenty to give, but because you always believed if you gave enough, they wouldn't leave. You once loved through endurance, through listening without being heard, through understanding what no one ever asked how you felt about. You once sacrificed, not out of nobility, but out of fear of loss. You held on, not because it still fit, but because you had invested too much to let it go. And then, one day, you sat quietly in your own exhaustion and asked, what kind of love requires me to shrink myself? What kind of love always asks me to tone down just to be accepted? You no longer blamed them, no longer blamed yourself. You simply began to see a deeper truth. You had never loved from fullness. You loved from lack. Love, for you, had once been a silent negotiation. I give you the feeling of being loved. Please stay. I carry your emotions, call it compatibility. I fill the empty space in. You please don't leave me. And then you burned out. Not because you loved the wrong person, but because you loved without ever choosing yourself first. Carl Jung didn't speak much about romantic love, but he spoke often about the shadow within love, about the invisible wounds we bring into our relationships, about how we seek someone else to heal the parts we are too afraid to face ourselves. You once found that someone who made you feel special, but only when you performed. Someone who made you feel worthy, but only as long as you gave. And you were willing to do it all, just to be called someone who knows how to love, but who loved you while you were busy loving everyone else except yourself. Until one day, you stopped bargaining, stopped measuring, stopped waiting for them to change, stopped trying to understand why they couldn't love you the way you needed. Not because you stopped loving them, but because you stopped abandoning yourself. You looked in the mirror, and instead of asking, "Why don't they see I'm enough?" you asked, "Why haven't I chosen someone who makes me feel whole?" You stopped begging for love and started offering it consciously. Love no longer came from a fear of being alone, not from the need to be seen, not from the pressure of being coupled to feel valid. Love began to arrive like a natural current from someone who no longer needed to prove they were worthy. That love wasn't loud, wasn't rushed, wasn't in a hurry to define the relationship. That love wasn't a contract of exchange, but a meeting between two people, not to fill each other up, but to stand whole beside one another. You no longer needed love to be someone's somebody. You needed love where you could still be you, free enough to be different, safe enough not to shrink, true enough to say, "I'm feeling tender today. Can you hold space for that?" And if they couldn't, you didn't get angry. You simply pulled your hand back and held yourself, not rejection, just the knowing, this is not where I grow anymore. Love was no longer the place to prove your goodness, nor to reclaim what you never received as a child. Love now is a space still enough to listen, bright enough to see each other, and deep enough not to need to shout in order to be understood. You can be in a relationship and still be whole. You can share without dissolving. You can need without clinging. You can leave without blaming. And that's when you know true love doesn't come to possess you. It comes to open you gently, layer by layer. You no longer need anyone to fill the emptiness inside, because now you've returned to sit within it, like a dear friend, like a mother who finally understands you, like yourself. No demands, no conditions. And from that place, love comes not to negotiate, but to become. There are moments when you say no without needing to justify it, without raising your voice, without feeling guilty. And in that moment, you know something within you has changed, not because you've become hardened, but because you've returned closer to yourself. In the past, boundaries were something you only built after you'd been pushed too far. When you were so exhausted, you broke down crying in the bathroom. When your kindness was mistaken for obligation. When you held it all together and then fell apart. You only knew how to set limits after you were already hurt. You believed that if you were kind enough, people wouldn't cross the line, that if you loved hard enough, they would know where to stop. But you forgot. Love doesn't mean living without boundaries. Love requires boundaries to survive. You used to think boundaries were cold, but now you've begun to understand boundaries are an act of love. Love for yourself, strong enough to say, "I'm not available for that energy. I won't allow disrespect to define this relationship. I still care about you, but I no longer choose to engage in this kind of connection." Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, and you cannot become who you truly are if you continue allowing others to cross the boundaries that protect your wholeness." You were once the woman who didn't know how to say no, who smiled while her heart was tangled, who nodded even when her soul whispered, "I'm so tired." And one day, you smiled and said no, softly, clearly, with certainty, not from anger, but because you had forgiven yourself for forgetting your worth for so long. True boundaries don't separate. They create space for what is worthy of love to breathe. They protect your peace. They filter out what shrinks you, weakens you, or tries to pull you back into a version of yourself you've outgrown. They don't reject people. They preserve what is real for you. You now set boundaries from love, not fear, not because you're afraid of being hurt, but because you understand. Love cannot thrive in ambiguity. It cannot be free in invasion. It cannot be healthy if it must trample over your values just to survive. You once compromised fearing the loss of connection. Now, you choose to remain whole because, you know, the connection meant for you. will never demand your silence in exchange. You once tried to understand, so they would stay. Now, you understand yourself well enough to walk away when something is no longer safe for your soul. You once stayed believing you could fix everything. Now, you stay only where your heart feels respected. Not everyone will understand your boundaries. Not everyone will accept them. And you've learned how to smile, even when misunderstood. Because you know, you're no longer living to be understood. You're living to be true. You don't set boundaries to create distance. You set boundaries to protect what is sacred. And if someone cannot exist within that respect, you still love them, but from a safer distance for your heart. That's not retreat. That is growth. When you finally realize, it's not that you don't love anymore. It's that you've learned to love yourself more. You once believed that to heal, you had to become better, less angry, less sad, less needy, less wrong. You read books. You meditated. You did everything you could to step out of the darkness. But the more you tried to step out, the more it felt like you were rejecting a part of yourself that was deeply real, a part that once cried from abandonment, a part that was furious from not being heard, a part that screamed silently just to feel like it existed. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." The shadow is not something you need to destroy. It is the part of you you once hid, once feared, once felt ashamed of. And because of that, you never embraced it with love. Then one day, you stop running. You stop resisting your own anger. You stop pretending not to feel jealous. You stop smiling when your heart is full of disappointment. And instead, you sit down, you breathe, and you say, "I see you. I'm here." For the first time, the shadow doesn't scream. It grows quiet, like a child who has finally been looked in the eyes, not to be fixed, but to be met. Your shadow isn't malice. It's the unheld wounds, the voice you were once taught to silence, the wild part of you that was once called too much, too weak, too sensitive. You once hid it beneath a mask of kindness, behind the role of the put-together girl, behind the repeated words, "I'm fine," like a hollow mantra. But then you got tired, and you chose truth, not truth for others, truth for yourself. You no longer needed to be the perfect woman. You began to love even the parts of yourself that didn't feel so polished. You saw your selfishness and forgave it. You saw your judgments and embraced them. You saw your fear and refused to abandon yourself again. The shadow was no longer a threat. It became an old companion, carrying lessons left unlearned. When you stopped resisting, the shadow began to offer gifts. From your anger, you rediscovered your boundaries. From your envy, you uncovered your truest desires. From your pain, you found compassion. The shadow, no longer frightening. When you're strong enough to sit beside it without falling into it, you're no longer consumed by it. You're no longer deceived into thinking, "I'm a terrible person." You simply see, this is part of me. But it's not all of me. You begin to move through the world, not with a polished exterior, but with a heart exposed, broken, soft, uneven, but no longer afraid of itself. And that is power, not because you've conquered anything, but because you've integrated it. The shadow doesn't need your teachings. It needs your presence. No retreat, no rushing to fix, no rejection. It needs you to be the mother you once needed. The mother who holds a crying child without asking why. The mother who doesn't turn mistakes into shame. The mother who says, "You are still worthy of love, even in your messiest moments." And now, you're learning to become that mother for yourself. That's when the shadow melts into the light, not because you shined a spotlight on it, but because you offered it a seat at the table of your soul. It no longer screams for attention. It no longer hides in self-sabotage. It becomes a part of you, whole, compassionate, honest. You once lived to do things right, to play your role well, to keep others at ease. You spent many years not living from your essence, but from expectations, from ideals, from should and must. You had to be gentle, had to be capable, had to be strong, had to always control your emotions so you wouldn't become a burden. You were all of those things, and no one knew how deeply tired you were. Then one day, you stopped trying, stopped racing to prove your worth, stopped saying the things you were supposed to say, stopped smiling while breaking inside. You began to live from a place of deep stillness within, a place that needed no validation, no immediate understanding, no permission from others before you could believe in yourself, a place only you could reach, a place called your true self. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." The greatest gift of life is not becoming the ideal self, not a better version, but simply being yourself when there is nothing left to hide behind. You still work, still raise your children, still hold relationships, but something has changed. You're no longer the woman who keeps everything running by abandoning herself. No longer the one who is always right, always kind, always trying to understand others at the cost of her own energy. Now, you begin each day with questions. How do I feel? What do I need? Is this true for me? And you live from truth, not performance. You no longer try to be the light. You simply stop running from the dark. And from there, you begin to shine naturally, effortlessly, without needing to be noticed. You begin choosing differently. You walk away from spaces that require you to shrink in order to fit. You decline shallow conversations that leave you drained. You say no, not out of resistance, but to protect the sacredness in your heart. You no longer live to be loved. You live as if you are already love itself, no longer filling your emptiness with others, no longer trying to be the adorable version, no longer asking for permission to be who you are. You simply are. You don't need to explain why you're different. You just walk in a quiet dignity. Those who remain are the ones who can meet your new frequency. Those who leave, go gently because you no longer cling. You know, you don't need to hold on to what no longer belongs to your soul. Your presence is now your answer, a prayer, a silent vibration that touches everything you encounter. No need for many words, no need to move fast. Just your true presence fully in your own life. You no longer live to perform, no longer live to survive, no longer live for approval. You live because that is what your soul has always been waiting to do, to live truly, freely, without fear. And that is when, you know, you have come home, not to a place, but to a frequency where you don't need to be anyone, where silence speaks loudest, where your heart is finally heard from within. If you've stayed with me all the way to this point, perhaps you, too, can feel you're no longer the same as when you began. Not because you've learned something new, but because you've just touched a quiet space, one you've been unconsciously avoiding for a long time. That silence doesn't live in books, doesn't reside in theories. It lives in the place where your soul has always been waiting for you to return. Carl Jung left no sermons. He left a blank space, a door slightly ajar, a wordless calling. Not everyone hears it. Not everyone is ready. But if you're sitting here now, in this stillness, then perhaps you've begun to hear it. You don't need to answer. You don't need to understand. Just be still and breathe. Because when you begin to live as if the soul is immortal, you will realize this life has never been ordinary. If there is one thing you take with you after this video, let it be this. You don't need to become anyone. You only need the courage to no longer abandon yourself. And if one day you find yourself soft again, full of contradictions, feeling as though you're slipping back into an old version of yourself. Please don't blame yourself. Just sit quietly and whisper this to your heart. I'm still on my way home.